Sociology as a form of consciousness. If the previous chapter has been successful in its presentation, it will be possible to accept sociology as an intellectual preoccupation of interest to certain individuals. To stop at this point, however, would would in itself be very unsociological indeed. The very fact that sociology appeared as a discipline at a certain stage of Western history should compel us to ask further how it is possible for certain individuals to occupy themselves with it and what the preconditions are for this occupation. In other words, in other words, sociology is neither a timeless nor a necessary undertaking of the human mind. If time is conceded, the question logically arises as to the timely factors that made it a necessity to specific men. Perhaps, indeed, no intellectual enterprise is timeless or necessary, but religion, for instance, has been well nigh universal in provoking intensive mental preoccupation throughout human history, while thoughts designed to solve the economic problems of existence have been a necessity in most human cultures. Certainly, this does not mean that theology or economics, in our contemporary sense, are universally present phenomena of the mind, but we are at least on safe ground if we say that there always seems to have human thought directed towards the problems that now constitute the subject matter of these disciplines. Not even this much, however, can be said of sociology. It presents itself rather as a peculiarly modern and Western cogitation, and, as we shall try to argue in this chapter, it is constituted by a peculiarly modern form of consciousness. The peculiarity of sociological perspective becomes clear with some reflection concerning the meaning of the term society, a term that refers to the object par excellence of the discipline. Like most terms used by sociologists, this one is derived from common usage, where, this, where its meaning is imprecise. Sometimes it means a particular band of people, as in society for the prevention of cruelty to animals. Sometimes only those people endowed with great prestige or privilege, as in Boston society ladies, and on other occasions it is simply used to denote company or any sort. For example, he greatly suffered in those years for lack of society. There, there are other less frequent meaning as well. The sociologists use the term in a more precise sense. Two, of course, there are differences in usage within the discipline itself. The sociologist thinks of society as denoting a large complexity of human relationships, or to put in more technical language, as referring to a system of interactions. In the, of interaction. The word large is difficult to specify quantitatively in this context. The sociologist may speak of a society including millions of human beings, say American society, but he may also use the term to refer to a numerically much smaller collectively, say the society of second-year students here. Two people chatting on a street corner would hardly constitute a society, but three people stranded on an island certainly will. The applicability of the concept then cannot be decided on quantitative grounds alone. It rather applies when the complex of relationships is sufficiently succinct to be analyzed by itself, understood as an autonomous entity set against others of the same kind. The adjective social must be similarly sharpened for sociological use. In common speech, it may denote once more a number of different things. The informal quality of a certain gathering. This is a social meeting. Let's not discuss business. Altruistic attitude of somebody's part. He had a strong social concern in his job. Or, more generally, anything derived from contact with other people a social disease. The sociologists will use the term more narrowly and more precisely to refer to the quantity of interaction, interrelationship mutually. Thus, two men chatting on a street corner do not constitute a society, but what transpires between them is certainly social. Society consists, consists of a complex of such social events. As to, exact, as to the exact definition of the social, it is difficult to improve on Max Weber's definition on a social situation as one in which people orient their actions toward one another. The web of meanings, expectations, and conduct resulting from such mutual orientation is a stuff of sociological analysis. Yet, this refinement of terminology is not enough to show up the distinctiveness of the sociological angle of vision. We may get closer by comparing the latter with the perspective of other disciplines concerned with human actions. The economist, for example, is concerned with the analysis of processes that occur in society and that can be described as social. These processes, these processes have to do with the basic problem of economic activity, the allocation of scarce goods and services within a society. The economists will be concerned with these processes in terms of the way in which they carry out or fail to carry it this function. The sociologists, in looking at the same processes, will naturally have to take into consideration their economic purpose, but his distinctive interest is not necessarily related to this purpose as such. He will be interested in a variety of human relationships and interactions that may occur here and that may be quite irrelevant to the economic goals in question. Thus, economic activity involves relationships, relationships of power, prestige, prejudice, or even play that can be analyzed with only marginal reference to the properly economic function of the activity.
The sociologist finds his subject matter present in all human activities, but not all aspects of these activities constitute this subject matter. Social interaction is not some specialist sector of what men do with each other. It is rather a certain aspect of all these doings. Another way of putting this is by saying that the sociologist carries on a special sort of abstraction. The social as an object of inquiry is not a segregated field of human activity. Rather, to borrow a phrase from Lutheran sacramental theology, it is present in, with, and under many different fields of such activity. The sociologist does not look at phenomena that nobody else is aware of, but he looks at the same phenomena in a different way. As a first example, we could take the perspective of the lawyer. Here, we actually find a point of view much broader in scope that of the economist. Almost any human activity can, at one time or another, fall within the province of the lawyer. This indeed is the fascination of the law. Again, we find here a very special procedure of abstraction. From the immense wealth and variety of human deportment, the lawyer selects those aspects that are pertinent, or as he would say, material, to his very particular frame of reference. As anyone who has ever been involved in a lawsuit knows, the criteria of what is relevant or irrelevant legally will often greatly surprise the principals in the case indication. This need not concern you. This need not concern us here. We would rather observe that the legal frame of reference consists of a number of carefully defined models of human activity. Thus, we have clear models of obligation, responsibility, or wrongdoing. Definite conditions have to prevail before any empirical act can be subsumed under one of these headings, and these conditions are laid down by statutes of precedent. When these conditions are not met, the act in question is legally irrelevant. The expertise of the lawyer consists of knowing the rules by which these models are constructed. He knows, within his frame of reference, when a business contract is binding, when the driver of an automobile may be held to be negligent, or where rape has taken place. The sociologist may look at the same phenomena, but his frame of reference will be quite different. Most importantly, his perspective on these phenomena cannot be derived from statutes or precedent. His interest in the human relationships occurring in a business transaction has no bearing on the law and the legal on the legal validity of contracts signed, just as sociologically interesting deviance in sexual behavior may not be capable of being subsumed under some particular legal heading. From the lawyer's point of view, the sociologist's inquiry is extraneous to the legal frame of reference. One might say that, with reference to the conceptual edifice of the law, the sociologist's activity is subterranean in character. The lawyer is concerned with what may be called the official conception of the situation. The sociologist often deals with very unofficial conceptions indeed. For the lawyer, the essential thing to understand is how the law looks upon a certain type of criminal. For the sociologist, it is equally important to see how criminal looks at the law. To ask sociological questions then presupposes that one is interested in looking some distance beyond the commonly accepted or officially defined goals of human actions. It, presupp- it presupposes a certain awareness that human events have different levels of meaning, some of which are hidden from the consciousness of everyday life. It may even presuppose a measure of suspicion about the way in which human events are officially interpreted by the authorities, by their political, juridical, or religious character. If one is willing to go as far as that, it would seem evident that not all historical circumstances are equally favorable for the development of sociological perspective. It would appear plausible, in consequence, that sociological thought would have the best chance to develop in historical circumstances marked by severe jolts to the self-conception, especially the official and authoritative and general accepted self-conception of a culture. It is only in such circumstances that perspective men are likely to be motivated to think beyond the assertions of this self-conception and as a result question the authorities. Albert Salomon has argued cogently that the concept of society in its modern sociological sense could emerge only as the dogmatic structures of Christendom and later of the ancient regime were collapsing. We can then again conceive of society as the hidden fabric of an edifice, the rosette facet of which hides the fabric from the common view. In medieval Christendom, society was rendered invisible by the imposing religio-political facet that constituted the commonwealth of the European men. As Solomon pointed out, the more secular political facet of the absolute state performed the same function after the Reformation had broken up the unity of Christendom. It was with the disintegration of the absolute state that the underlying frame of society came into view, that is, a world of motives and force that could not be understood in terms of the official interpretations of social reality. Sociological perspective can then be understood in terms of such phrases as seeing through, looking behind, very much as such phrases would be employed in common speech, seeing through his game, looking behind the scenes, in other words, being open of all the tricks. We will not be far off if we see sociological thought as but of what Nietzsche called than utter mistrust. Now it would be a gross of now it will it would be a gross oversimplification to think that this art has existed only in modern times. Seeing through things is probably a pretty general function of intelligence, even in very primitive societies. The American anthropologist Paul Gardin has provided us with a vivid description of the skeptic as a human type in primitive culture. We also have evidence from civilization other than the modern West, bearing witness to forms of consciousness that could be well that could well be called proto-sociological. We could point, for the instance, to Herodotus or to Ibn Khaldun. There are even texts from ancient Egypt emphasizing a profound discontentment with a political and social order that has acquired the reputation of having been one of the most cohesive in human history. However, with the beginning of the modern era in the West, this form of consciousness intensifies, becomes concentrated and systematized, marks the thought of an increasing number of prospective men. This is not the place to discuss in detail the history of sociological thought, a discussion in which we owe very much to Solomon. Nor will we even give here an intellectual table of ancestors for sociology, showing its connections with Machiavelli, Erasmus, Bacon, 17th century philosophy, and 18th century belles lettres that has been done elsewhere and by others much more qualified than this writer. Suffice it to stress once more that sociological thought marks the fruition of a number of intellectual developments that have a very specific location in modern Western history. Let us return instead to the proposition that sociological perspective involves a process of seeing through the facets of social structures. We could think of this in terms of a common experience of people living in large cities. One of the fascinations of a large city is the immense variety of human activities taking place behind the seemingly anonymous and endlessly undifferentiated rows of houses. A person who lives in such a city will time and again experience surprise or even shock as he discovers the strange pursuit that some men engage in quite obtrusively in house that, from the outside, look like the others on a certain street. Having had this experience once or twice, one will repeat it find oneself walking down a street, perhaps late in the evening, and wondering what may be going on under the bright lights showing through a line of drawn curtains. An ordinary family engaged in a pleasant talk with guests, a scene of desperation amid illness or death, or a scene of debauched pleasures, perhaps a strange cult or a dangerous conspiracy. The facades of the houses cannot tell us, proclaiming nothing but architectural conformity to the taste of some group of or class that may not even inhabit the street any longer. The social mysteries lie behind the facades. The wish to penetrate to these mysteries is an analogon to sociological curiosity. In some cities that are suddenly struck by calamity, this wish may be abruptly realized. Those who have experienced wartime bombings know of the sudden encounters with unsuspected and sometimes unimaginable fellow tenants in the airtight shelter of one's apartment building, or they can recollect the startling morning sight of a house hit by a bomb during the night, neatly sliced in half, the facade torn away, and the prefuse hidden in interior mercilessly revealed in the daylight. But in most cities, that one may normally live in. The facades must be penetrated by one's own inquisitive intrusions. Similarly, there are historical situations in which the facades of society are violently torn apart and all but the most incurious are forced to see that there was a reality behind the facades all along. Usually, this does not happen, and the facades continue to confront us with seemingly rock-like permanence. The perception of the reality behind the facades then demands a considerable intellectual effort. Uh, a few examples of the way in which sociology looks behind the facets of social structures might serve to make our argument clearer. Take, for instance, the political organization of a community. If one wants to find out how a modern American city is governed, it is very easy to get the official information about this subject. The city will have a character, operating under the laws of the state, with some advice for informed individuals. One may look up various statutes that define the constitution of the city. Thus, one may find out that this particular community has a city manager form of administration, or that party affiliation affiliations do not appear on the ballot in municipal elections, or that government city government participates in a regional water district. In similar fashion, with the help of some newspaper reading, one may find out the officially recognized political problems of the community. One may read that the city plans to annex a certain suburban area, or that there has been a change in the zoning ordinance to facilitate industrial development in another area, or even that one of the members of the city council has been accused of using his office for personal gain. All such matters still occur on day as is where visible, official or public level of political life. However, it would be an exceedingly naive person who would believe that this kind of information gives him a rounded picture of the political reality of that community. The sociologist will want to know above all the constituency of the informal power structure, as it has been called by Floyd Hunter, an American sociologist interested in such studies, which is a configuration of men and their power that cannot be found in any status and probably cannot be read about in the newspaper. The political scientist or legal expert might, might find it very interesting to compare the city character with the constitutions of the other similar communities. The sociologist will be far more concerned with discovering the way in which powerful vested interests influence or even control the actions of the official elected under the charter. This vested interest will not be found in City Hall, but rather in the executive suites of corporations that may not even be located in the community, in the private mansions of a handful powerful men, perhaps in the office of certain labor unions or even, in some instance, in the headquarters of criminal organizations. When the sociologist concerns himself with power, he will look behind the official mechanisms that are supposed to regulate power in the community. This does not necessarily mean that he will regard the official mechanism as totally ineffective or their legal definition as totally illusionary. But at the very least, he will insist that there is another level of reality to be investigated in the particular system of power. In some cases, he might conclude that to look for real power in the publicly recognized places it is quite delusional. Take take another example. Protestant denominations in America differ widely in their so-called polity. That is the officially defined way in which the denomination is run. One may speak of an Episcopal, a Presbyterian, or a Congregational polity. meaning by this not the denominations called by these names, but the forms of ecclesiastical governmental government that various denominations share. For instance, the episcopal form set by Episcopalian and Methodist, and congregational by Congregationalists and Baptists. In nearly all cases, the polity of a denomination is the result of a long historical development and is based on a theological rationale over which the doctrinal experts continue to quarrel. Yet, a sociologist interested in studying the government of American denominations would do well not to arrest himself too long at these official definitions. He will soon find that the real questions of power and organization have little to do with polity in the theological sense. He will discover that the basic form of organization in all denominations of all sizes is bureaucratic. The logic of administrative behavior is determined by bureaucratic processes only, only very rarely by the workings of an episcopal or congregational point of view. The sociological investigator will then quickly see through the mass of confusing terminology denoting office holders in the ecclesiastical bureaucracy and correctly identify those who hold executive power, no matter whether they be called bishops or state clerks or synod presidents, understanding denominational organization as belonging to the much broader species of bureaucracy. The sociologist will then be able to grasp the processes that occur in the organization, to observe the internal and external pressures brought to bear on those who are theoretically in charge. In other words, behind the facade on, of an episcopal polity, the sociologist will perceive the workings of bureaucratic apparatus that is not terribly different in the Methodist Church, an agency of the federal government, General Motors of the United Automobile Workers. Or take an example from economic life. The personal manager of an industrial plant will take delight in preparing brightly colored card, ca- cards, charts that show the table of organization that is supposed to administer the production process. Every man has his place. Every person in the organization knows from whom he receives his order and to whom he transmits them. Every work team has its assigned role in the great drama of production. In reality, things rarely work this way, and every good personnel manager knows his. Superimposed on the official blueprint of the organization is a much subtler, much less visible network of human groups with, with their loyalties, prejudices, antipathies, and most important codes of behavior. Industrial sociology is full of data on the operations of this informal network, which always exists in varying degrees of accommodation and conflict with the official system. Very much the same coexistence of formal and informal organization are to be found wherever large numbers of men work together or live together under a system of discipline, military organizations, prisons, hospitals, schools, going back to the mysterious leagues that children form among themselves and that their parents only rarely discern. Once more, the sociologists will seek to penetrate the smoke screen of the official factions of reality, those of the foreman, the officer, the teacher, and try to grasp the signals that come from the underworld, those of worker, the enlisted man, the schoolboy. Let us take one further example. In Western countries, and especially in America, it is assumed that men and women marry because they are in love. There are broadly based popular mythology about the character of love as a violent, irresistible emotion that strikes where it will, a mystery that it is the goal of most young people and often of the not so young as well. As soon as one investigates, however, which people actually marry each other, one finds that the lightning shaft of Cupid seems to be guided rather than strongly within very definite channels of class, income, education, racial and religious background. If one then investigates a little further into the behavior that is engaged in prior to marriage under the rather misleading euphemism of courtship, one finds channels of interaction that are often rigid to the point of ritual. The suspicion begins to dawn on one that most of the time it is not so much the emotion of love that creates a certain kind of relationship, but that carefully predefined and often planned relationships eventually generate the desired emotion. In other words, when certain conditions are met or have been constructed, one allows oneself to fall in love. The sociologist investigating our patterns of courtship and marriage soon discovers a complex web of motives related in many ways to the entire institutional structure within which an individual lives his life, class, career, economic ambition, aspirations of power and prestige. The miracle of love, how now, the miracle of love now begins to look somewhat synthetic. Again, this need not mean in any given instance that the sociologist will declare the Romantic interpretation to be an illusion. But once more, he will look beyond the immediately given and publicly approved interpretations. Contemplating a couple who in their turn are contemplating the moon, the sociologist need not feel constrained to deny the emotional impact of the scene thus illuminated, but he will observe the machinery that went into the construction of the scene in its non-lunar aspects. The status index of the automobile from which the contemplation occurs, the canons of taste, and taste is and, te- and taste that determines of custom of the contemplators, the many ways in which language and demeanor place them socially, the social location and intentionality of the entire enterprise. It may have become clear at this point that that the problems that will interest the sociologists are not necessarily what other people may call problems. The way in which public officials and newspapers and, alas, some college textbooks in sociology speak about social problems serves to obscure this fact. People commonly speak of a social problem when something in society doesn't work the way it is supposed to according to to the official interpretations. They then expect the sociologists to study the problem as they have defined it and perhaps even to come with a solution that will take care of the matter to their own satisfaction. It is more important, against this sort of expectation, to understand that a sociological problem is something quite different from a social problem in this sense. For example, it is naive to concentrate on crime as a problem because law enforcement agencies so define it, or on divorce because that is a problem to the moralists of marriage. Even more clearly, the problem of the foreman to get his men to work more efficiently, or of line officer to get his troops to charge the enemy more enthusiastically need not to be problematic at all to the sociologist, leaving out the consideration for the moment the probable fact that the sociologist asked to study such problems is employed by corporation or the army. The sociological problem is always the understanding of what goes on here in terms of social interaction. Thus, the sociological problem is not so much why some things go wrong from the viewpoint of the authorities and the management of the social scene, but how the whole system works in the first place, what are its presuppositions and by what means it is held together. The fundamental sociological problem is not crime but the law, not divorce but marriage, not racial discrimination but racially defined stratification, not revolution but government. This point can be explicated further by an example. Take a settlement house in a lower class slum district trying to win away teenagers from the publicly disapproved activities from a juvenile gang. The frame of reference within which social workers and police officers define the problems of this situation is constituted by the word of middle class, respectable, publicly approved values. It's a problem if teenagers drive around in stolen automobiles, and it is a solution if instead they will play group games in settlement house. But if one changes of, of the but if one changes the frame of reference and looks at the situation from the viewpoint of the leaders of the juvenile gang, the problems are defined in reverse order. It's a problem for the solidarity of the gang if its members are seduced away from those activities that lend prestige to the gang within its own social world, and it would be a solution if the social workers went where the hell back uptown where they came from. What is a problem to one social system is the normal routine of this to the other system and vice versa. Loyalty and disloyalty, solidarity and, defiance are defined in contradictory terms by the representatives of the two systems. Now, the sociologist may, in terms of his own values, regard the world of middle-class respectability as more desirable and therefore want to come to assistance of the settlement house, which is its missionary outpost in Partibus Infidelium. This, however, does not justify the identification of the director's headaches with what are problems sociologically. The problems that sociologists will want to solve concern an understanding of the entire social situation, the values and modes of action in both systems, and the way in which in which, in which and the way in which the two systems coexist in space and time. Indeed, this very ability to look at a situation from the vantage points of the competing systems of interpretation is, as we shall see more clearly later on, one of the hallmarks of sociological consciousness. We would contend then that there is a debunking motive inherent in sociological consciousness. The sociologist will be driven time and again by the very logic of his discipline to debunk the social systems he is studying. This unmasking tendency need not necessarily be due to the sociologist's temperament of inclinations. Indeed, it may happen that the sociologist, who as an individually may be of a conciliatory disposition and quite inclined to discard the comfortable assumptions on which he rests his own social existence, is nevertheless compelled by what he is doing to fly in the face of what those around him take for granted. In other words, we will contend that the roots of the banking motive in sociology are not psychological but methodological. The sociological frame of reference, with its building in procedure of looking for levels of reality other than those given in the official interpretations of society, carries with it a logical imperative to unmask the pretensions and propaganda by which men cloak their actions with each other. This unmasking imperative is one of the characteristics of sociology, particularly at home in temper of the modern era. The debunking tendency in sociological thought can be illustrated by a variety of developments within the field. For example, one of the major themes in Weber's sociology is that of the unintended foreseen consequences of human actions in society. Weber's most famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he demonstrated the relationship between certain consequences of Protestant values and the development of the capitalist ethos, have often been misunderstood by critics precisely because they miss this theme. Such critics have pointed out that Protestant thinkers quoted by Weber never Protestant thinkers quoted by Weber never intended their teachings to be applied so as to produce the specific economic result in question. Specifically, Weber argued that the Calvinist doctrine of predestination led people to behave in what he called an in a worldly ascetic way, that is, in a manner that concerns itself intensively, systematically, and selflessly with the affairs of this world, especially with economic affairs. Weber's critics have then pointed out that nothing was further from the mind of Calvin and the other leaders of the Calvinist Reformation. But Weber never maintained that Calvinist thought intended to produce these economic action patterns. On the contrary, he knew very well that their intentions were drastically different. The consequences took place regardless of intentions. In other words, Weber work, and not only the famous part of it just mentioned, gives us a vivid picture of the irony of human actions. Weber's sociology Weber's sociology thus provides us with a radical antithesis to any views that understand history as the realization of ideas or as the fruit of the deliberate efforts of individuals or collectivities. This does not mean that at all that ideas are not important. It does mean it does mean that the outcome of ideas is commonly very different from what those who had the ideas in the first place planned or hoped. Such a consciousness of the irony aspect of history is sobering, a strong antidote to all kinds of revolutionary utopianism. The debunking tendency of sociology is implicit in all sociological theories that emphasize the autonomous character of social processes. For instance, Émile Durkheim, the founder of the most important school in French sociology, emphasized that society was a reality sui generis, that is, a reality that could not be reduced to psychological or other factors on different levels of analysis. The effect of this insistence has been a sovereign disregard for individually intended motives and meanings in Durkheim's study of various phenomena. This is perhaps most sharply revealed in his well-known study of suicide in the work of the title, where individual intentions of those who commit or try to commit suicide are completely left out of the analysis in favor of statistics concerning various social characteristics of these individuals. In the Durkheimian perspective, to live in society means to exist under the domination of society's logic. Very often, men act by this logic without knowing it. To discover this inner dynamic of society, therefore, the sociologist must frequently disregard the answers that the social actors themselves will give to his questions and look for explanations that are hidden from their own awareness. This essentially Durkheimian approach has been carried over into the theoretical approach now called functionalism. In functional analysis, society is analyzed in terms of its own workings as a system. Workings that are often obscure or opaque to, to those acting within the system. The contemporary American sociologist Robert Merton has expressed this approach well in his concepts of manifest and latent functions. The former are the conscious and deliberate functions of social processes, the latter unconscious and unintended ones. Thus, the manifest function of anti-gambling legislation may be to suppress gambling, its latent function to create an illegal empire for the gambling syndicates, or Christian missions in part of Africa manifestly tried to convert Africans to Christianity latently helped to destroy indigenous tribal cultures and thus provided an important impetus toward rapid social transformation. Or the control of Communist Party over all sectors of social life in Russia manifestly was to assure the continued dominance of the revolutionary ethos, latently created a new class of comfortable bureaucrats and uncannily bourgeois in its aspirations increasingly declined toward the self-denial of Bolshevik dedication. Oh, the manifest function of many voluntary associations in America is sociability and public service, the latent function to attach status indices to those permitted to belong to such associations. The concept of ideology, a central one in some sociological theories, could serve as another illustration of the debunking tendency it discussed. Sociologists speak of ideology as discussing views serve that serve to rationalize the vested interests of some group. Very frequently, such views systematically distort social reality in much the same way that an individual may neurotically deny the form or reinterpret aspects of his life that are inconvenient to him. The important approach of the Italian sociologist Vilfredo Pareto has a central place for this perspective, and as we shall see in a later chapter, the concept of ideology is essential for the approach called the sociology of knowledge. In such analysis, the ideas by which men explain their actions are unmarked as self-deception shall stop. The kind of sincerity that David Riesman has aptly described as the state of mind of a man who habitually believes his own propaganda. In this way, we can speak of ideology when we analyze the belief of many American physicians that standards of health will decline of the fee-for-service method of payment is abolished, or the conviction of many undertakers that inexpensive funerals show lack of affection for the departed, or the definition of their activity by quizmasters on television as education. The self-image the self-image of the insurance salesman as a fatherly advisor to young families, of the burlesque stripper as an artist, of the propagandist as a communication expert, of the hangman as a public servant. All these notions are not only individual assuagement of guilt or status anxiety, but constitute the official self-interpretation of entire social groups, obligatory for their members on pain of excommunication. In uncovering the social functionality of ideological pretensions of the sociologists will try not to resemble those historians of whom Marx said that every cursor is superior to them in knowing the difference between what a man is, what and what he claims to be. The debunking motive of sociology lies in this penetration of verbal smoke screens to the unadmitted and often unpleasant spring mainsprings of actions. It has been suggested above that sociological consciousness is likely to arise when the commonly accepted or authentic, authentically stated interpretations of society become shaky. As we have already said, there is a good case for thinking of the origins of sociology in France, the mother of country of discipline, in terms of an effort to cope intellectually with the consequences of the French Revolution, not only of the one great cataclysm of 1789, but of what the Foucault called the continuing revolution of the 19th century. If the French, if the French case, it is not difficult to perceive sociology against the background of the rapid transformation of modern society, the collapse of assets, the deflation of all creeds, and the absence of the frightening new forces on the social scene. In Germany, the other European country in which an important sociological movement stood in 19th century, the matter has a rather different appearance. If one may quote Marx once more, the Germans had a tendency to carry on in professors' studies the revolutions that the French performed on the on the on the battles. At least one of the this acad- at least one of these academics wrote revolution, perhaps the most important one, might be sought in the broadly based movement of thought that came to be called historicism. It is not the place to go into the full story of this movement. Suffice it to say that it represents an attempt to deal philosophically with the overwhelming sense of the relativity of all values in history. This awareness of relativity was an almost necessary outcome of the immense accumulation of German historical scholarship in every conceivable field. Sociological thought was at least partly grounded in the need to bring order and and intelligibility to the impression of chaos that this array of historical knowledge made on some observers. Needless to stress, however, the society of German sociologists was changing all around him, just as was that of that of his French colleagues, as Germany rushed toward industrial power and nationhood in the second half of the 19th century. We shall we shall not pursue these questions too. If we turn to America, the country in which sociology came to receive its most widespread acceptance, we find once more a different set of circumstances. Though again, against a background of rapid and profound social change, in looking at this American development, we can detect another motif of sociology related to that of debunking, but not identical with its fascination with the unrespectable view of society. In at least every Western society, it is possible to distinguish between respectable and unrespectable sectors. In that respect, American society is not in a unique position, but American respectability has a particular pervasive quality about it. This may be ascribed in part, perhaps, to the lingering after effects of the Puritan way of life. More probably, it has to do with the predominant role played by the bourgeoisie in shaping American culture. Be this be this as it be be this as it may, in terms of historical causation, it is not difficult to look at social phenomena in America and place them readily in one of these two sectors. We can perceive the official, respectable America represented symbolically by the Chamber of Commerce, the churches, the schools, and other centers of civic ritual. But facing this world of respectability in another America present in every town of any size, an America that has other that has other symbols and that speaks another language. This language is probably its safest identification tag. It is the language of the purgum and the poker game of bar and the poker game of bars and brothels and army barracks. It is not it, but it is also the language that breaks out with a sigh of relief between two salesmen having a drinking in the parlor car as the train races past clean little Midwestern villages on Sunday morning, with clean little villagers trooping into the whitewashed sanctuaries. It is the language that is suppressed in the company of ladies and clergymen, owing its life mainly to oral transmission from one generation of huckleberry fiends to another, though in recent years the language has found literary deposition in some books designed to thrill ladies and clergymen. The other America that speaks this language can be found wherever people are excluded or exclude themselves from the world of middle class propriety. We find it in those sections of the working class that have not yet proceeded too far on the road of embourgeoisement in slums, shanty towns, and those parts of cities that urban sociologists have called area of areas of transition. We, we find it expressed powerfully in the world of the American Negro. We also come on it we also come on it in the subworlds of those who have, for one reason or another, withdrawn, withdrawn voluntarily from Main Street and Madison Avenue. In the words of hipsters, homosexual, hobos, and other marginal men, those words that are kept safely out of sight on the streets where the nice people live, work, and amuse themselves and family. Though, though these words may on some occasions be rather convenient for the male of the spacious nice people, precisely on occasions where he happily finds himself sans family. American sociology, accepted early both in academic circles and by those concerned with welfare activities, was from the beginning associated with the official America with the work of policymakers in community and nation. Sociology today retains this respectable affiliation in university, business, and government. The appellation hardly induces eyebrows to be raised except the eyebrows of such certain racists sufficiently literate to have read the footnotes of the segregation decision of 1954. However, we would contend that there has been an important undercurrent in American sociology relating it to that other America of dirty language and disenchanted attitudes, that state that state of mind that refuses to be impressed, moved, or be fooled by the official ideologies. This unrespectable perspective on the American scene can be seen more clearly in the figure of Thorstein Veblen, one of the early important sociologists in America. His biography itself constitutes an exercise in marginality, a difficult, querulous character, born on a Norwegian farm on Wisconsin frontier, acquiring English as a foreign language, involved all his life with morally and politically suspect individuals, an academic migrant, an inveterate seducer of other people's women. The perspective on America gained from this angle of vision can be found in unmasking satire that runs like a purple thread through Veblen's work, most famously in his theory of leisure class, that merciless look from the underside at the pretensions of the American haute bourgeoisie. Veblen's view of society can be understood most easily as a series of non-Cartesian insights his understanding of conspicuous consumption as against the middle class enthusiasm for the finer things. His analysis of economic processes in terms of manipulation and waste as against the American productivity ethos. His understanding of the machinations of real estate speculation as against the American community ideology, most bitterly his description of academic life and the higher learning in America in terms of fraud and flatulence as against the American cut of education. We are not associating ourselves here with a certain neo-Fabianism that has become fashionable with some younger American sociologists, not arguing the Fabian was a giant in the development of the field. We are only pointing off to his irrelevant curiosity and clear-sightedness as marks of a perspective coming from those places in the culture in which one gets up to shave about noon on Sundays. Nor are we arguing that clear-sightedness is a general trait of unrespectability, stupidity, and sluggishness of thought are probably distributed quite fairly throughout the social spectrum. But where there is intelligence and where it manages to free to free itself from the goggles of respectability, we can expect a clearer view of society than in those cases where the oratorical imagery is taken for real life. A number of developments in empirical studies in American sociology furnish evidence of this same fascination with the unrespectable view of society. For example, looking back, looking back at the powerful development of urban studies undertaken at the University of Chicago in 1920s, we are struck by the ap- by the apparently irresistible attraction to the shimmer sides of city life upon these researchers. The advice to his students of Robert Park, the most important figure in this development, to the effect that they should get their hands dirty with research often enough, meant quite literally an intense interest in all the things that North Shore resident residents would call dirty. We sense in many of these studies the excitement of discovering the picturesque undersides of the metropolis, student study of sun life, of the melancholy world of rooming houses, of skid row, of the worlds of crime and prostitution. One of the offshoots of this so-called Chicago School has been the sociological study of occupations, due very largely to the pioneering work of Everett Hodges and his students. Here also we find a fascination with every possible world in which human beings live and make a living, not only with the worlds of the respectable occupations, but with those of the taxi driver, the apartment house janitor, the professional boxer, or the jazz musician. The same tendency can be discovered in the course of American community studies following in the wake of the famous Middletown studies of Robert and Hayden Lynn. Inevitably, these studies had to bypass the official fictions of community life to look at the social reality of the community, not only from the perspective of City Hall, but also from that of the city jail. Such sociological procedure is ipso facto a resputa- ipso facto a refutation of the respectable presupposition that only certain views of the world taken are, take, are to be taken seriously. We would not want to give an exaggerated impression of the effect of such investigations on the consciousness of sociologists. We are well aware to, of the elements of muckraking and romanticism inherent in some of these. We also know that many sociologists participate as fully in the respectable Weltanschauung as all the other PTA members on the block. Nevertheless, we would maintain that sociological consciousness predisposes one towards an awareness of worlds other than that of middle class respectability, an awareness which already carries within itself the seeds of intellectual unrespectability. And the second Middletown study of the Lynns have given a classic analysis of the mind of middle class America in their series of core statements, that is, statements that represent a consensus so strong that the answer to any question concerning them will habitually be prefaced with the words of course. Is your economy one of free enterprise? Of course. Are all are all our important decisions arrived at through through the democratic process? Of course. Is monogamy the natural form of marriage? Of course. The sociologist, however conservative and conformist he may be in his private life, knows that there are serious questions to be raised about every one of these of of course statements. In this knowledge alone, he is brought to the threshold of unrespectability. This unrespectable motive of sociological consciousness need not imply a revolutionary attitude. We will even go that, uh, further than that and express the opinion that sociological understanding is inimical to the revolutionary ideologies, not because it has some sort of conservative bias, but because it sees not only through the illusions of the prison status quo, but also through the illusionary expectations concerning possibly further futures, such expectations being the customary spiritual nourishment of revolutionary. This non-revolutionary and moderating soberness of sociology we would value quite highly. Most regrettable, from the viewpoint of one's values, is the fact that sociological understanding by itself does not necessarily lead to a greater tolerance with respect to the foibles of mankind. It is possible to view social reality with comparison or with cynicism, both attitudes being compatible with clear-sightedness. But whether he can bring himself to human sympathy with the phenomena he is studying or not, the sociologist will, in some measure, be detached from the taken for granted postures of his society and respectability, whatever its ramifications in the emotions, and the will must remain a constant possibility in the sociologist's mind. It may be segregated from the rest of his life, overlaid by the routine mental states of everyday existence, even denied ideologically. Total respectability of thought, however, will invariably mean the death of sociology. This is one of the reasons why genuine sociology disappears promptly from the scene in totalitarian countries, as is well illustrated in the instance of Nazi Germany. By implication, sociological understanding is always potentially dangerous to the minds of policemen and other guardians of public order, since it will always tend to relativize the claim to absolute righteousness upon which such minds like to rest. Before concluding this chapter, we will look once more on this phenomenon of relativizations that we have already touched upon a few times. We would now say explicitly that sociology is so much in tune with the temper of the modern era precisely because it represents the consciousness of a world in which values have been radically relativized. This relativization has become so much part of our everyday imagination that it is difficult for us to grasp fully how close and absolutely binding the world views of the art of other cultures have been and in some places still are. The American sociologist Daniel Lerner, in his study of the contemporary Middle East, the passing of traditional society, has given us a vivid portrait of what modernity means as an altogether new kind of consciousness in those countries. For the traditional mind, for the traditional mind, one is what one is, where one is, and cannot even imagine how one could be anything different. The modern mind, by contrast, is mobile, participates vicariously in the lives of others, preferably located from oneself, easily imagines itself itself changing occupation or residence. Thus, Lerner found that some of the illiterate respondents to these questionnaires could only respond with, with laughter to the question as to what they would do if they were in the position of the rules and would not even consider the question as to the circumstances under which they would be willing to leave their native village. Another way of putting this would be to say is would uh, Another way of putting this would be to say that traditional societies assign definite and permanent identities to their members. In modern society, identity in in modern society, identity itself is uncertain and in flux. One does not really know what is expected of one as a ruler, as a parent, as a cultivated person, or as one who is sexually normal. Typically, one that requires various experts to tell one. The book club editor tells us what culture is, the interior designer what tastes we ought to have, and the psychoanalyst who we are. To live in modern society means to live at the center of kaleidoscope of ever-changing goals. Again, we must forego the temptation of enlarging on this point, since it would take us rather far afield from argument into a general discussion of the social psychology of modern existence. We would rather stress the intellectual aspect of this situation, since it's in that aspect that we would see an important dimension of sociological consciousness. The unprecedented rate of geographical and social mobility in modern society means that one becomes exposed to an unprecedented variety of ways of looking at the world. This insights into other cultures that one might gather by travels travel are brought into one's own living room to the mass media. Some once defined urban sophistication as being the capacity to remain quiet and unperturbed upon seeing in front of one's house a man dressed in the turban and lo- loincloth, a snake coiled around his neck, beating a tom bottom as he leads tiger down the street. No doubt, there are degrees to such sophistication, but a measure of it, but of, but a measure of it is acquired by every child who watches television. No doubt also, this sophistication is commonly one superficial and does not extend to any real grappling with alternate ways of life. Nevertheless, the immensely broadened possibility of travel in person and through the imagination implies at least potentially the awareness that one's own culture, value, including its basic values, is relative in space and time. Social mobility, that is, the movement from one social stratum to another, augments this relativizing effect. Wherever industrialization occurs, a new dynamicism is injected into the social system. Masses of people begin to change their social position. in groups or as individuals. As, and usually, this change is in an upward direction. With this movement as individuals, biography often involves a considerable journey not only to a variety of social groups but to the intellectual universes that are, so to speak, attached to these groups. Thus, the Baptist male clerk who used to reach the Reader's Digest becomes an Episcopalian junior executive who reads the New Yorker, or the faculty wife whose husband becomes department chairman may graduate from the bestseller list to prose or Kafka. In view of this overall validity of worldviews in modern society, it should not surprise us that our age has been characterized as one of conversion. Nor should it be surprising that intellectuals especially have been prone to change their worldviews radically and with amazing frequency. The intellectual attraction of strongly presented theoretically theory, theoretically closed systems of thought such as Catholicism or communism has been frequently commented upon. Psychoanalysis, in all its forms, can be understood as an institutionalist mechanism of confection in which the individual changes not only his view of himself but of the world in general. The popularity of a multitude of new cults and creeds presented in different degrees of intellectual refinement depending upon the educational level of the clientele is another manifestation of this proneness to conversion of our contemporaries. It almost seems as if modern man, and especially modern educated man, is in a perpetual state of doubt about the nature of himself and of the universe in which he lives. In other words, the awareness of relativity, which probably in all ages of history has been the possession of a small group of intellectuals, today appears as a broad cultural fact reaching far down into the lower reaches of the social system. We do not we do not want to give the impression that the sense of relativity and the resulting proneness to change one's entire well-timed sound are manifestations of intellectual or emotional immaturity. Certainly, one should not take with too much seriousness some, representatives of this pattern. Nevertheless, we will contend that an essentially similar pattern becomes almost a destiny in even the most serious intellectual enterprises. It is impossible to exist with full awareness in the modern world without realizing that moral, political, and philosophical commitments are relative. That in Pascal's words, what is truth on either side of Pyrenees is error on the other. Intensive occupation with the more fully elaborated meaning systems available in our time gives one a truly frightening understanding of the way in which these systems can provide a total interpretation of reality, within which will be included an interpretation of the alternate systems and of the ways of passing from one system to another. Catholicism may have a theory of communism, but communism returns the complement and will produce a theory of Catholicism. To the Catholic thinker, the communist lives in a dark world of materialist delusion about the real meaning of life. To the communist, his Catholic adversary is helplessly caught in the false consciousness of a bourgeois mentality. To the psychoanalysis, both Catholic and communist may simply be acting out on the intellectual level of the conscious impulse, impulses really really move them, and psychoanalysis may be to be Catholic and escape from from the reality of sins and to the communist and avoidance of the realities of society. This means that the individual's choice of viewpoint will determine the way in which he looks back upon his own biography. American prisoners of war brainwashed by Chinese communists completely changed their viewpoints on on social and political matters. To those that returned to America, this change represent, represented a sort of illness brought on by outward pressure, as a, convalescent may look back at delirious dream. But to the former captors, this change, the consciousness represents a brief glimmer of true understanding between long periods of ignorance. And to those prisoners who decided not to return, their conversion may still appear as the decisive passage from darkness to light. Instead of speaking of conversion, a term which religiously charged no connotations, we would prefer to use the more neutral term of alternation to describe this phenomenon. The intellectual situation just described brings with it the brings with it the possibility that an individual may alternate back and forth between logically contradictory meaning systems. Each time, the meaning system he enters provides him with an interpretation of his existence and of his world, including in this interpretation an explanation of the meaning system he has abandoned. Also, the meaning system provides him with tools to combat his own doubts. Catholic conventional discipline, communist autocriticism, and the psychoanalytic techniques of coping with resistance all fulfill the same purpose of preventing alternation out of the particular meaning system, allowing the individual to interpret his own doubts in terms derived from the system itself, thus keeping himself within it. Just keeping him within it. On lower level of sophistication, there will also be various means employed to cut off questions that might threaten the individual's allegiance to the system, means that one can see at work in the dialectical acrobatics of even such relatively unsophisticated groups as Jehovah's Witnesses or Black Muslims. If one resists the temptations if one resists the temptation, however, to accept such dialectics and is willing to face squarely the experience of relatively brought on by the phenomenon of alternation, then one comes into possession of yet another crucial dimension of sociological consciousness, the awareness that not only identities but ideas are relative to specific social locations. We shall see in a later chapter the considerable importance of this awareness for sociological understanding. Suffice it to say here that this relativizing motive is another of the fundamental driving forces of the sociological enterprise. In this chapter, we have tried to outline the dimensions of sociological consciousness through the analysis of three motives, those of debunking, unrespectability, and relativizing. To these three, we would finally add a fourth one, much less far-reaching in its implications, but useful in rounding out our picture, the cosmopolitan motif. Going back to very ancient times, it was in cities that there developed an openness to the world, to other ways of thinking and acting. Whether we think of Athens of Alexandria, of medieval Paris, of Renaissance Florence, or of the turbulent urban centers of modern history, we can identify a certain cosmopolitan consciousness that was especially characteristic of city culture. The individual, then, who is not only urban, but urban is one who, however passionately he may be attached to his own city,
roams through the whole wide world in his intellectual voyages. His mind, if not his body and his emotions, is at home wherever there are other men who think. We would submit the sociological consciousness is marked by the same kind of cosmopolitanism. This is why a narrow parochialism in its focus of interest is always a danger signal for the sociological venture, a danger signal that, unfortunately, we would hoist even quite a few sociological studies in America today. The sociological perspective is a broad, open, emancipated vista on human life. The sociologist, at his best, is a man with a taste for other lands, inwardly open to the measureless richness of human possibilities, eager for new horizons and new worlds of human being. It probably requires no additional elaboration to make the point that this type of man can play a particularly useful part in the course of events today.